This week on To the Contrary.
First, the United Nations goes after the Vatican for its priest pedophilia scandal. Then, there are 24 libido-enhancing medications on the U.S. market for men, none for women. Behind the headlines, the impact of West Virginia's coal chemical spill on women and families.
Bonnie Erbe. Welcome to the Contrary, a discussion of news and social trends from diverse perspectives. Up first, the Vatican's woes.
Pope Francis may be meeting the greatest challenge yet to his papacy. In Geneva this week, the Vatican came under intense scrutiny from the United Nations for mishandling its global child sex abuse scandal. During a public grilling, the UN slammed a Vatican delegation for continuing to cover up and protect pedophile priests. The Holy See is regarded as a sovereign entity, but the Vatican says it lacks a legal system to prosecute guilty priests, and that should be handled by law enforcement. Last month, Pope Francis organized a child protection committee to address the child sex abuse scandal, but UN officials and former rape victims say nothing has really changed.
So Darlene Kennedy is relatively new. Pope Francis doing enough to make actions about the scandal transparent in the Vatican?
Well, you know, he has denounced the problem and he has created a commission, which is great first steps. But I believe he has to go further in that he needs to have every archdiocese across the world disclose everything, and they need to begin defrocking these priests.
No. The Vatican has no legitimate moral authority in the areas of sexuality and human rights.
This is really troubling because I feel that there's a shifting of blame here. This is not leadership. People look to the Vatican for leadership, and where's the leadership when shifting blame is happening?
He's definitely not done enough. I think this Pope is a good man. I think he has good intentions, but he has to unravel a culture of corruption, and that's a hard job for anybody.
Well, but, you know, to us, this story seemed really significant for the victims, for the families, because everybody loves this Pope so far. You know, he's gotten rave reviews. But is he going to be able to keep it that way if he keeps essentially stonewalling on this issue that he promised to come in and clean house on?
No, I don't think he can. I mean, he comes, you're right, to the fore with a great deal of sort of gravitas, because he is reaching out, really attracting individuals to a religion that, frankly, had people turning the other way, given how they have behaved in the wake of this tremendous injustice in these scandals, reaching out to the poor, making very great sort of overtures in terms of sexuality, frankly, when you talk about the LGBT community. But still, there's obstruction when we're talking about making sure that rapists receive the justice that they deserve. He needs to change that if he expects to maintain the moral authority that he's attempting to inject into this institution.
I mean, she's absolutely right. He has to bring the hammer down and bring it down hard on these archdioceses, because prosecutions aren't occurring because they're not disclosing information. They're hiding it from everyone. And until he says you have to release it, you know, we're not going to get anywhere. It's just going to be kept swept under the rug, and that's not acceptable.
You're a Catholic, and
yes.
You go to church every week.
Yes.
Okay. Have you seen? Is your church growing since he came? Since he took over?
Probably. My church is not a good example because I go to a basilica and it's in the middle of the city, so we don't have a lot of families there. But I do. What I hear is that people are coming back to the church because they do feel there's a welcoming, and that's a good thing. But
how will this situation, for example, the Vatican's ambassador to the Dominican Republic was charged with, not charged, but there were many claims out there that he had molested many children in that small Caribbean nation. And instead of, getting him prosecuted, they called him back, and he's since disappeared. This is something that Pope Francis could handle directly by not getting involved and not getting that guy to resurface and face local charges. What will that do to parishioners and their impression of him?
Well, it certainly will affect parishioners' perception, because they will feel that, yet again, they're keeping it under the rug, and that he is not really willing to make the moves to expose this.
Well, and you look at the fact that last winter, just a few months ago actually, they set up a committee to look into this more. The Vatican did. And the issue is that it has no judicial authority. In fact, it's supposed to provide care for the victims, which is just mind-boggling to think about, because the all-male hierarchy has proven that it's the worst situated to provide care for victims of child sexual abuse within the church. One statement that I found very troubling during these hearings was, it was claimed that, hey, priests don't have to respond. We don't have to respond for priests here in the UN because they're represented by, or they're part of individual states, right? And so they're citizens of individual states and not the Vatican. And what's so troubling about that is that the Vatican really wants to play it both ways. It wants to say, hey, when it's child sexual abuse and we are in front of an international body, we're going to claim that they're citizens of distinct states. However, we believe that we should be able to insert ourselves into international affairs, to have a say in how treaties proceed globally. So it's very troubling.
Yeah, and I want to go a little deeper into that too, which on that point, which is that at the same time that they're saying they have no jurisdiction, they do have a penal code, and they're helping priests cover up. Now, how quickly is it reasonable? The Vatican moves at molasses speed. We know that. All huge institutions do, particularly this one that took 500 years to unexcommunicate Galileo for saying the earth wasn't flat. 500 years is not lightning speed. Sure. So how long would it be reasonable for people to expect Pope Francis to make some true headway on this?
It should have happened yesterday, let's be honest. This has been a long time. I can remember so many years ago, in the 90s, we started to hear about these things. In the early 2000s, people's lives being turned upside down, people coming out with admissions of, I was molested, and all under the Catholic, really the banner of Catholicism. And it's sad that so many people have left the church because of their feelings of leadership. With this new Pope, we thought, here comes somebody reasonable. Here's somebody who's willing to shift the whole thing on its head. So it's completely unreasonable that he's looking to the bishops now and saying, deal with it there. Sure, they might not have some judicial authority in some spaces, but it's like, you can't have your cake and eat it too. And that's what he's trying to do right now. It's going to be a long time, I think, until we see the pressure fall on him. Right now, we're still at the beginning of the story. Again, like you said, everything moves very slowly over there, so it's going to be a while.
You want to stand up for him? I mean, are Catholics going to give him more time than yesterday?
I think he's moving forward, but not at the pace he needs to. This should have been addressed years and years and years ago. And it's unfortunate that these people have suffered. And in some instances, what I've been reading, that they're still suffering. So until these priests are kicked out and then prosecuted, if possible, this is never going to change.
And what does it say, you mentioned in the open, about moral authority on sexual matters? What is the fact that Pope Francis has not moved authoritatively, decisively, and perceptibly at this point to get rid of this scandal, to open the wound, give it some air, and let it heal and get rid of it? What does it say about what he's going to be? Has it all been talk about, not kicking gays out of churches and, giving women more power within the church?
Oh, please. The moral authority of Pope Francis and the all-male hierarchy of the Roman Catholic Church is about this big on matters of sexuality and human rights. We saw recently the bishops sent out someone to testify for an anti-abortion rights bill in Congress very recently, when we're supposed to be focusing instead on social justice and poverty, according to what the Pope had said. The words are ringing really hollow, and it's incredibly concerning in this matter of priest sexual abuse, because you have victims all over the world who have not yet received justice. You still have the Vatican continuing to cover up, continuing to not publicly release its records, continuing to try to play it both ways. Let's deal with it internally on one hand and not release our records. At the same time, not really having any teeth in its mechanisms for how it deals. No judicial authority with this new committee. And so, in fact, it was just last summer, early spring, that they had defined criminal sexual abuse as a crime rather than just simply something not to do within the church. So it's very concerning, and we shouldn't look to the Pope for moral leadership on these matters.
All right. Let us know what you think. Please follow me on Twitter at Bonnie Erbe and at To the Contrary. From the Vatican to women's health.
Was a recent government drug decision sexist? Yes, says a company developing a drug to treat women with low libido. The Food and Drug Administration refused to greenlight the drug flibanserin, saying it only produced modest results. But manufacturer Sprout Pharmaceuticals claims clinical trials show significant improvement in the women who took the drug. Some experts believe low sex drive in women is linked to relationship issues, but doctors working on the drug say that's incorrect. There are 24 FDA-approved treatments in the U.S. for male sexual dysfunction. There are none for women.
So, Erin, was this a sexist decision on the part of the FDA?
Well, we don't know much about this decision because the FDA doesn't release information unless if they approve a drug. So the fact that they didn't approve it, we don't know. Here's what we do know. We know that women and sexuality, this is a conversation that is either taboo or it's objectified and pornified for the consumption of primarily men. And so we don't have an honest conversation about women and sexuality. However, on that issue of sexism in the FDA, I do think that women have reason for caution and concern about the FDA and its practices. I can refer to a couple things. You had Dr. Susan Wood resigning in 2005 over political pressure that hampered the approval of emergency contraception. Recently, the news that emergency contraception, in fact, isn't safe as a common brand for women over 176 pounds. Excuse me, not safe, not effective. And finally, the fact that the FDA, which is charged with overseeing cosmetics, only bans 11 of over 1,000 ingredients banned in the European Union for, these things that we put on our face every single day. And so I do think there's reason for skepticism, concern, and caution in this area.
Oh, as you said, it is a taboo topic, and I believe part of the problem that there aren't more medications or more supplements for women with this issue is that they don't talk about it. They don't tell their doctors. They don't talk among themselves, and there's some shame. I believe that they feel some shame to it. But I think moving forward, as a society, we are opening up the dialogue and getting more comfortable with these issues. And just like men can have 24, women should have 24 if they needed to.
Exactly. I mean, this is a situation where you have an overarching culture, which, as you mentioned, does not want to talk about women's sexuality, want to pretend that we all got here, I guess, through the Virgin Mary, apparently. We all want to think of our mothers in that way, right? And so, but the reality is that, it's not all in women's heads. This seems to be the overarching theme, the narrative that's out there, is that if women are having a problem, it's because it's an emotional problem. Women are just emotional creatures. It also could be a physical problem. I believe that, obviously, just as men have physical ailments that could impact their ability to perform sexually, I think that women could have the very same issues in our own way. And so the fact that there are 24 different medications on the market right now that would specifically meet that problem for men and absolutely zero for women means that women's sexual health, frankly, is not being taken seriously in this country. If only in the fact, and only the way, practically only the way that it's taken seriously is when we talk about ways in which we can repress women's sexuality.
Is this market-driven at all, do you think? Is there a claim to be made that maybe there's not a market for female version of Viagra, or what?
I think there's some support for that kind of claim. Certainly, I'll agree. Women's sexual desires are not spoken about enough. There are many of us who were raised with the feeling that you should never speak about it publicly. You shouldn't run out to your local pharmacy and grab something if you're feeling like you've got a low libido. My gosh, that thought would never occur to me because I was raised to not think that way. Now, of course, in our culture, we know that men are hear me roar, type of beat my chest. I need something to help me get it up in the bedroom, basically. And that's where all these drugs came about. People saying we want to help men do their jobs in the bedroom. Well, what's the woman's job in the bedroom? To be submissive, to lay there, to not have desires herself. We don't talk about these things enough. But the claims that there is not enough support, not enough popularity for these kind of things, I think, well, you'll have people who support them, but the great many people will say that's pure malarkey.
But let me say, it's not like there's a claim out there. That's not.
Yeah.
These were my words asking
sure.
whether it might be. And what do you think as a strong supporter of?
Well, I think that there would be women. I mean, I feel like we have an aging society, and women don't want to leave their sexuality on the sidelines when they get over 35, over 40, over 50. Women are still beautiful. We look at the First Lady. She's 50. She's fabulous. You know, now 50 is the new 30. 60 might be the new 40. And as women age, they might have some physical ailments that would impact their ability to perform in the bedroom. Just because they're getting a little bit older doesn't mean they want to leave their femininity behind. They want to express it in every way, and sexuality would be included in that.
Freely chosen, consensual, healthy sexuality. I mean, that's a wonderful, joyful thing. And so if women feel like they want a little help with something, I think that, you know, it'd be great if there was something out there to help them. But one thing that I have concern about is the way we talk about Viagra is generally that it's a physical ailment, whereas with women, you know, and impotence is seen as a physical problem. With women, it's that she's frigid and that there's something wrong with her mentally or emotionally and that she's somehow a really tough, stubborn, bad person that we shouldn't be around. There's a whole stereotype that's associated with that goes far beyond sexuality.
And how do we change that? I mean, aside from just having this discussion.
Well, I think embracing sex is a wonderful thing, and embracing that it's joyful, that it's wonderful, that people have a right to have sex, that people, that sex is part of normal life, that it's part of our human rights to enjoy it, is something that we need to keep drumming the beat on, especially for women, because that's something that hasn't been said.
But is that a generational thing? I mean, it's interesting, you being the youngest on the panel, and you're saying you were raised more old school. But, I mean, other women of your generation,
we talk about it openly. We blog about it. True. I mean, I'm now a victim of the people around me. I've become like them. I'm talking about it openly, probably much to my mother's chagrin. But the reality is it's out there, it's open, and women are no longer expected to sit on the sidelines and say, look, I don't enjoy this, or I don't need help. Sure, we need help, and we want to talk about it openly. But back to the story about the FDA here, I don't think this was exactly sexist. I think maybe there was a problem with the drug. We don't know, as you made mention of. It's like they didn't come out and tell us what was exactly wrong, so there may just have been a problem with the formulation. We don't exactly know that it was just because it was a women's drug.
All right. Thank you very much, everybody. Great segment. Behind the headlines, women, families, and chemical spill disasters.
Life is slowly returning to normal in West Virginia after a chemical spill contaminated the water supply for 300,000 people last week. The chemical is one used to clean coal. It spilled into the Elk River from a leaky storage tank. West Virginia law does not require inspections for chemical storage facilities, only for production facilities. This particular tank had not been inspected since 1991.
I've seen people drink polluted water that had diesel fuel floating in it. And they'd look at you and say, what choice do we have?
Noted community and environmental advocate Maria Gano is a leader in the fight against mountaintop removal, a form of surface coal mining that uses explosives. Gano says the coal industry is destroying the water in the region.
When you blow that mountain up, all of the pollution that's in that mountain ends up in the water. So what runs off of that mountain ends up in the water, and this is the headwaters of drinking water throughout the United States. What don't get polluted through mountaintop removal with the streams, then you have the coal companies are pumping coal waste into underground abandoned mines, and it's ending up in our drinking water that way.
Maria took To the Contrary on an air and land tour to learn more about the impact of mountaintop removal. We'll have more of her story in an upcoming episode of To the Contrary.
My children grew up not being allowed to play in the streams that I was allowed to play in as growing up. And you don't realize how much that affects you as a person and your children.
Heather White of the Environmental Working Group, thank you so much for joining us on this topic. So this has been dominating the news for about 2 weeks now, and the latest warning was, okay, it's okay to drink the water unless you're pregnant. What does that mean? What does that say to the children and men who aren't pregnant and should not be, how safe it is for them?
Well, that's a great question. It means we all should be concerned, Bonnie, and I want to thank you, too, for this segment, because I think it's really important that you talked about this story in an energy context, because this isn't just about chemical safety. It isn't just about our drinking water. It's also about our energy choices, and that's, I think, something that's been lost in a lot of the coverage. But so we have this CDC warning for pregnant women, and here we are a week after the spill, where we don't really know what the long-term health effects are of this chemical. We don't know how much of the chemical was really released. We don't know how much it's going to cost to clean up. But we do know from Ken Ward of the Charleston Gazette, and I recommend anybody to read his coverage, just outstanding coverage of what's going on, is that emergency rooms are really overflowing. There are a lot of sick people, of nausea, vomiting, you name it. And, how did this happen? I mean, that's a great question. And the way that this happened is because the EPA does not require the chemical companies, and our federal law does not require the chemical companies to share this information. This particular
but
plant,
it also didn't, there hadn't been an inspection since 1991.
Absolutely.
How did that happen?
Well, there's a couple ways. First, this facility is in a regulatory black hole, as you mentioned, because chemicals aren't manufactured there. They're just stored there as part of this cold processing facility. So the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, and even our Federal Emergency Response Act doesn't actually apply to this facility. So because they weren't expected to discharge this chemical into the water. So what we have is a situation where no one is actually looking at this issue. We hear so much about overregulation. We hear about EPA, but very few EPA inspectors or even OSHA inspectors come to these facilities, and it really should be a wake-up call for all of us, because one of the key things here, Bonnie, is the reason we know about this is because the chemical has a distinctive smell. It smells like licorice. So residents actually called the state officials and said, what's going on? And only then did we get an inspection. So it is quite possible that things like this are happening across the country with chemicals that don't have a smell. But there's a real need for us to reform our laws and really put more money into inspections.
And what is your group, and if anybody wants to jump in here and comment about what should be done, but what is, meanwhile, what is EWG, which I think is the largest, how would you describe yourselves? You work for environmental regulation of all kinds of chemicals that affect, in cosmetics, in household goods, and certainly, in chemical spills, to get them, to keep consumers aware of what's going on and to try to get those products off the market. Right?
Absolutely. Well, the first thing we need to do is really look at the Toxic Substances Control Act, which is the federal toxics law, and it's the only law that really has squarely jurisdiction here. And it assumed that this particular chemical was safe in 1976 when the law was passed. And what happens is that we now have the burden, consumers and residents, to show that the chemical that everyone's been exposed to in West Virginia is unsafe, rather than the chemical companies sharing all this information. I think a great example is this CDC warning that you talked about. There's little or no information in all of these public databases that the EPA, that the CDC, and all these other health agencies have. They just don't have any information on the long-term health effects, and the companies are holding the cards.
I'd like to get Rina in here because you're from
I'm from West Virginia. I was born and raised in coal country, and this occurred less than an hour by car from where I grew up. I just spent the past 2 weeks at home, and I really am sickened and saddened by this whole thing. But West Virginians are resilient. They've been through things like this before. This happened in Chemical Valley. They're not strangers to this, but in some sense, coal is being really blamed here. And to me, this was a chemical issue first, a coal industry issue second. Of course, this took place at a facility that cleans the coal before it's sent off to power plants. But I think the biggest thing we have to look at here is let's not point fingers except at the bad actors. And these bad actors need to be punished. West Virginia has seen these incidents in the past few years. The Upper Big Branch coal tragedy happened in my hometown where miners were underground. They died there. And these big corporations are not being punished. Overregulation is not the answer. We've got to punish the bad actors. And that's
how do you punish them without regulation?
You don't start with regulation. I think you go after them first. Where were the where were the missteps? What happened? This company we know, Freedom Industries, hadn't updated their equipment at all. And of course, with no inspectors going in saying to do it, but it was their fault. They had no plan in place. It was responsible. They needed to be responsible, and they weren't.
All right. I wish I had time to get Heather back in there to respond, but we're out of time. That's it for this edition of To the Contrary. Please follow me on Twitter at Bonnie Erbe and at To the Contrary, and visit our website, pbs.org/To the Contrary, where The discussion continues, and whether you agree or think to the contrary, please join us next time.